with from your own words. So I definitely like to hear your thoughts on it too.
I'm trying to remember exactly what context that was in the book, but I don't remember. Although I mean, that's what the whole book is about. I mean, it's about many things, but one of the kind of like, you know, like narrative problems at the heart of the book is my obsession with knowing what's going to happen. And that was, in the context of, first in the book, a relationship that had ended with a boyfriend I dated briefly. And, I just wanted certainty in that relationship. I wanted certainty that we would get back together. And then I think examining that opened up space for me to write about like all the other areas in which I was obsessed with knowing. I wanted to know, was I going to live in Seattle forever? How was I going to do it? And I just wanted permanence. I wanted certainty. And the process, I think, I got there eventually because I had to realize that was a problem in order to write the book. I worked on white magic for about 8 years, and most of those years were totally fruitless. I was just trying to outline a novel and outline a memoir, and I just wanted to know exactly what was going to happen in the book, what shape it was going to take. Wanted to plan out the whole thing, have my goals, have my number of words per day that I needed to hit, and none of that worked. What finally worked was just really letting go of all that and seeing like if I just listened and just tried basically and experimented and played around and did things on the page that made me feel good and made me feel, invested, then I just figured I would know the end when I saw it. And then I did. So it was really, the mystery was so many things in this book. It was a spiritual mystery, and it was an interpersonal mystery, and a mystery of self. But, it was very much a mystery of narrative, like what's going to happen at the end, how am I going to exit this book?
Yeah, I love that. Also clearly themed throughout all three of these books is the idea of ourselves reflected in the land that we come from or occupy, as well as the non-human relations that we share that land with, which I think follows really traditional modes of recollection. The idea that in embedding ourselves and our stories in the landscape, we can pick those lessons back up again at a later time. And I'm just curious, how do you each see your work dealing with that intersection of self, land, and memory? Heid, I noticed this especially in Little Big Bully and the poem Story of These Creatures, where you use treaty as a metaphor for your own body as well as the land, which I think ultimately ended up inspiring this particular question. So if you could start us off, that'd be wonderful.
Talk about letting mystery in. I try really hard not to think about how somebody's gonna look at my book while I'm working on it. And when you first said that, I thought the first thing I thought of was a different poem, a poem that has the Fool, a card from a tarot deck, to share another theme. And the fact that you can see a landscape in many of the depictions of this card, the Fool. And it also too goes toward, conversation about the land and the native woman's body and the land in a not benign sense. So yeah, I think that often as I was thinking about the methods of abuse and how we are prepared to be abused, it so quickly turned over to my thoughts about legal language of termination, the language of treaty, and how we have to negotiate for our being in this world continually. So yes, that connects to the land, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a beautiful illustration of that too. Leanne, I think in your work, this is taken fairly literally in some ways with the intersection of self, land, and memory, in that there are these 7 different characters making up the various parts of the protagonist, and many of those are land-based or non-human relative-based. Can you talk about how you think your work deals with this intersection?
I was thinking about the division between living things and non-living things, things that have spirit within Anishinaabe thought. And I was thinking about, that was sort of one of the interventions that the book was making. And I was thinking about all of the different beings that I share time and space with. So while there were humans in those 7 main characters, there was also a caribou spirit, there was a maple tree, and these characters were sort of beings were seamlessly interacting with each other in a deeply relational way that sort of becomes the setting of the book. These complex relationships in time and space becomes the setting. And I was also thinking about land, not just sort of the bush, but also the fragments of bush that are in urban settings, and the city as Indigenous land as well, and how different beings forge connection and belonging to each other and to those yet to be born, and also those ancestors. So I was also thinking about this idea of past, present, and future. And I wanted the book to have to focus on the present as a collapsing in of the past and the future and on themselves, because it felt like what we do in the present gives birth to the future. So the presence for me the present tense had a really important sort of responsibility in terms of world building and moving things along in a particular way. So I think the land, when you think of the land, there's certain images that go into your brain, but I think the more that I thought about it, the more that the land became this series of very deep, reciprocal, complex relationships with other living things across time and space. And that was creatively very generative for me in this book.
Yeah, I love the way that your characters interact with one another to craft that space. Alyssa, I found in your work you talk about memory palaces existing outside of yourself, in the land and the seasons. So if you could talk about the same question and how your work sits at that intersection, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think I didn't realize how much I was writing a book about land until it had happened. I didn't set out to do that, but the more that I think back, about this book, I realized that even though it's about, on its surface, it presents itself as being about this, heartbreak. And I think in many ways, like it really is about the loss of my everyday relationship with the land that I was on, and just how, different, the reality I had there is not accessible to me. It's gone. It's not there. It's not here with me anymore. There's, I can look at pictures. I can play video games where I'm pretending to ride a horse through something that looks sort of like Western Washington, but I don't have those everyday relationships right now with the cedar trees that were outside of my apartment in Edmonds, or the stellar jays that used to knock on the window. So I think the book, in part for me, was a way to use memory to get as close as I possibly could to, at first when I was writing it in Seattle, I think that it was a project about kind of anticipating that I was going to lose that relationship. I knew it was going to happen. building narrative, building detail, and like forming something that was so solid that I would be revising again and again, made certain that I wouldn't forget the things that had been so important to me. And then, it is like evocative detail is sort of like a memory palace where I can go through a paragraph and then, from section to section to remember the way, to remember the map of the neighborhood I used to live in Seattle for a few years, or, the route to the ferry to get across the sound. All of these things I think are really most accessible to me through the way I choose, the stylistic choices I make, the structural choices I make, and the, just what I choose to hang on, or what I'm able to hang on to as detail from that world.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your relationship with that land and your pages with us.
My pleasure.
Something I really admire about all three of you is your ability to use narrative as a means of, as the panel title suggests, talking back to the project of colonialism. I'm particularly struck by how, despite being three very different genres of work, all three of these titles have a narrative of resistance that I think really echoes one another. Could you talk a little bit about how, existing in a colonized present, you've come to use words, and often English words at that, to disrupt a colonial framework? Leanne, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you, because I think that Nupaming really inspired this question, particularly in the method of storytelling you use, that I think speaks to this, particularly in pronoun usage and the way that causes, I think, very necessary abstraction. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
I think one of the places the book started for me was in the work of Susanna Moody and her book that was written in the mid 1800s called Roughing It in the Bush. And she was sort of a white woman in Canada that's been very celebrated as a settler writer, as a colonist writer. And she was writing about my people and my territory, and wrote this sort of guidebook for settlers who were coming in and encountering the Anishinaabe. But I wanted to not sort of critique that work head on. I wanted to build Anishinaabe worlds in the present that would have existed, in the mid 1800s, in the late 1800s, that have always existed, but that white supremacy causes people not to be able to see the brilliance and the beauty of these worlds. So I sort of refer to the book Roughing It in the Bush in the title with the word Nopaming, and then I don't speak to it again other than to, I think, through the poetry and the narrative, try to bring some of the practices, some of the Anishinaabe practices through the oral tradition and through our language into the book. So this gave way to using they, them pronouns to have a more expansive view of gender in the book and amongst the characters. It was a collapsing of different genres in terms of Western literary tradition. There's sort of a circular nature to the book in terms of time and space. I wanted the book to really celebrate sort of Anishinaabe joy, and have the trauma and the violence more to the margins. So have it there because it's part of our lives, but give space to these other practices and emotions that are so important in terms of my life and my community. I wanted to have these characters, some of which were human and some of of which we're not, being interacting with each other in sort of intimate, lovely ways, and creating this place that exists in spite of urbanization or colonialism or cities or climate change or all of the things that are trying to erase or kill. And I think that that's sort of what I was trying to accomplish with the book. So not sort of using colonialism as almost a jumping off point into another world that I loved living in while I was writing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and the way that your characters interact with each other, I think, really reflects that. Let's see. Alyssa, I think I felt this in your essays and the way you use narrative to make sense of what happens to you, which to me felt very much the way I see my ancestors used narrative too. Do you think you could speak to this question of disrupting colonial frameworks in that context?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's really, I'm obsessed with form, and especially with form as a way of really making a book my own space. And, you know, I think about how like land acknowledgements are, you know, these little compact moments at the very beginning of an event. And, you know, it's unusual for them to be longer than, I don't know, a certain amount of time. I didn't want to just take up the space that I knew was allotted to me by the publishing industry. You know, I wanted to write the longest book that I could get away with. I wanted it to be more like a, you know, like tribal council meeting where it's supposed to go for like 3 hours, but then it's 2 o'clock and they're handing out string cheese to the elders. And, you know, and like, you've gone through 3 agenda items or something. Like, I wanted a relationship with time that felt authentic to me. And, you know, English is the only language I speak, but I think that, you know, the way I was brought up with understanding time is in my style and in my, you know, my structures and the way I put this book together, my relationship with narrative. It's digressive, and it's, you know, there are lots of refusals in the book that I think are very much structural decisions. Like, you know, the essays that really get into my ancestors' history are there, but they're, you know, on the way to get there, there's Phil Collins and Fleetwood Mac, and you know, my crushes and infatuations and my tarot cards, and I think that I wanted to really just, again, like make the narrative my own space that's authentic to me. And if, you know, like it had to be something other than what the reader was expecting. And I wanted readers to be delighted anyway.
Well, I know I certainly was. And if you in your book were leading a tribal council meeting, I'd sit through 8 hours for sure. Yeah, another huge important piece of each of these works focuses on the future, which I think at times can feel really daunting to imagine. Not only that, but I think perhaps many mainstream conceptions of the future don't necessarily have a very full scope or consider an Indigenous lens on that scope. Can you reflect a little bit about how you hold space to imagine Indigenous futures and where you draw your inspiration from when thinking about those futures? I know you just finished talking, but Alyssa, if you could start this off. I think what really drew me to this question in a big way was your summation of legend and how it often wasn't or isn't structured to have a beginning, middle, and end, but rather be continuous and move through time. So if you could start that off.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I include an old story about a girl who turns into a shark in the book. And I was always fascinated by the way it ended. It was never told to me. I don't know anybody who actually knows the story, but I read it in a book of stories collected by an anthropologist. And at the very end, there's a note about that's, kind of topically unrelated to what precedes it, about how the girl was really good at basket making. And it felt like it just it ended the story with making me ask so many questions and wanting to know so much more about this person who turned into a shark. I think that has a lot to do with how I think about the future in my work. Like I was talking about before, part of my obsession with certainty that I had to let go of in writing this book was not knowing what's going to happen. I was really obsessed with anticipating it to the point where I was trying to like divine it and use magic to find out what was going to happen. And so I think right now, where I got to in the book and where I got to in life at the moment is that I finally feel like I don't need to have necessarily firm plans for what the future should look like. I could have, desires and maybe outcomes I expect could happen if I do certain things or don't do certain things. But I just think that it was so important through writing the book to find a way to let the future be just full of possibilities and completely open. And that's really something I know I've always loved about narrative structure. Once I learned, first in writing short stories and then in writing essays about how to end a story, how to end a narrative. I remember being a very beginning writer and learning that I didn't have to resolve everything at the end. I could just leave it open. It really felt like a short story was a magic trick. Like I didn't have to close everything down and make sure the reader knew everything. I could just hand it over. And I think that's what I try to do with all of my work, is get to a point where I've done enough that I can hand it over to the reader and they can do what they want with the rest.
I love that. Heid, I think in Little Big Bully, it felt like a lot of the imaginings of the future came through most strongly towards the end, particularly in the title, Dream of the Land-Based Future. Do you think you can give us a little bit of insight into the way you hold space for dreams of these futures and where you might draw inspiration from?
The literal inspiration for a lot of those poems were actual dreams. Often when I've been working hard on something, my dreams become, peculiar, to say the least. So I use those dreams as points to give a feeling of the sense of the future, and also just to fall in line with an aesthetic I have that's actually based on a spiral teaching, where we think of this spiral as this little flat image, but it actually is a dimensional thing, and where you start is where you end, or we continually in motion. So a lot of what I was doing was trying to point out how that was embedded in some of the poems that were about difficult presence or difficult grapplings with the past. Were really about how do you turn past that. You don't forget it, you continually move by it, but there is a sense of motion, depth, and then also just the baffling of readers' expectations that we go back when we go forward. That's actually how time works and humanity works. And my expectation is that cannot be destroyed, that will continue.
Yep. Yep. That ties in pretty perfectly to where I saw this with Leanne's work too, was how, I felt like Nupaming was bursting with imaginings of Indigenous presence and futures while, very much calling back to the past. So can you speak to the same question of how you hold space for those dreams of Indigenous futures, Leanne?
I think I wanted to have these characters in conversation with their ancestors and also with those yet to be born. And I wanted it to be sort of a camaraderie and a collective making of the present that then sort of sets the stage for the future. But I liked this idea of making things and making culture inside Anishinaabe culture. And I thought of my ancestors. I thought of, my mom and my grandma and how much stuff they make and they made over the course of the day, and how it's really easy for Leanne to go through life with just consuming things and never making anything. So I thought about, that practice of making things, getting up in the morning, making ceremony, making food, making clothes, making transportation, making story, making ceremony, making song, like making, and how that sort of aligns one's life with origin stories and creation stories, and how I think Indigenous artists are carrying on those practices. And I think when you're engaged in a making process, it was interesting when Heid said when you're in your creative phase that you have lots and lots of dreams. I think it sort of mobilizes energies and other beings, and there's movement, and I think that movement is so important in building and imagining and thinking through and figuring out how to work together and solve a particular problem, how to build a world. So I think that in this book, I wanted to have the characters really engaged in that making process, and to have that process not just be an individual process, but a collective imagining.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Pidamia Yippee to you three for that conversation. I want to make sure I make time for audience questions. So let's see. The first audience question we have is, what writers do you recommend we read next? Or what book have you recently read that inspired you? Heid, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, there's a book that is by Danielle Geller called
Dog Flower.
Dog Flowers, yes. That I was looking for a copy of it, and I must have given it away, but it is a memoir, and it is all based on this Dene woman, Danielle's experience of inheriting only this one box of stuff from her mom, and then picking through it to try to get a sense of who her estranged mother was. And it's just, to me, it's a fascinating way of, and just very distinct way of looking at the world and building a story. So I really enjoyed that. And for poetry, Altar for Broken Things, which is by Deborah Miranda, is another book that I recently enjoyed. Thanks.
Alyssa, how about you? What writers do you recommend we read next, or book have you read recently that inspired you?
So I've been reading my amazing grad students' work for, completely consumed by that for the longest time, but I'll show you what I'm reading right now. Love is an Ex-Country by Rhonda Girard. It's, I'm not very far, but I'm just so captivated by her voice and her use of narrative, and just the way I am completely absorbed in this person's mind and way of seeing and way of conveying. And so, yeah, that's mostly what I could say about it right now because I'm early on, but I do really recommend it. It's a memoir.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. Leanne, how about you?
I really enjoyed Junie DeSille's book that's called Eat, Salt, Gaze at the Ocean. She's a Haitian-Canadian poet based out of Vancouver, and she uses the idea of zombification as sort of a metaphor for Black Death. And so the title of the book is a cure for that. And it's just really a gorgeous book, and it encompasses sort of all the themes that this discussion has encompassed. So it was a pretty sweet read for me.
Yeah, that sounds really poignant. Another audience question that we've got is, I'd love to hear you all talk about the process of how your books are designed, from choices of covers and collaborations with other artists, as well as repetitious design choices across the page. For example, the use of Black pages, emoticons, and those cunning epigraphs for Alyssa. So why don't we start with you, Alyssa?
Yeah, so the emojis were my thing. I was using them, there needed to be some kind of segment separator, whether it was going to be white space or, the kind of typical asterisk type thing that we kind of put in as placeholders in the manuscript. But that essay was so much about, and a lot of the book is about communication and miscommunication, and the weight I put in emojis in communication. So that just seemed like a gesture that I wanted to play with, and it worked. But so many of the design choices, those were made by my publisher, and I had a lot of say in the process of I had a lot of chance to give input. I was thinking about the physical form I wanted the book to take. I wasn't very particular about it, but I was I'll hold it up for people who haven't seen it. I was really captivated by the idea of like 80s romance novels, and just that have the huge author photo on the back. Mine doesn't, but I think that with the gold spine, it's sort of evocative of that. And I don't know very much about the process that Jacob Valla, the designer, brought to this, but I find it really striking that there are these Black pages, and there's so much intention around the visuals of the book, which I think is it's just an amazing blending of all of the things that I kind of threw into a Google Drive folder as my my image board of posters of magicians from many decades ago, and romance novels, and spiritualist texts. So it's kind of meant to gather all of those in the same way that the book does.
Yeah, well, the visuals of your book are definitely really striking. Leanne, do you have any thoughts on the process of how your book's designed, the choice of the cover, collaboration with other artists on it, etc.?
Yeah, the cover of my book is an image from Rebecca Belmore, who's an Anishinaabe performance artist, and she's done covers for me before. But the image of this reclining woman was in a light box in Montreal, like on the street, as an intervention, as part of an art exhibit in 2008, and it was a very, very striking image. It's almost like a genderless sort of body. There's this huge gash, and it's been stitched up. The act of stitching up reminded me of that step in hide tanning, where you stitch up the holes, where you very lovingly stitch up the holes. And so it speaks, I think, to the trauma and the damage of colonialism as having a presence but not overtaking, and how we stitch those up and move on. So that, I think, added another layer to the book. There's also a series of other projects that are attached to this book. The midsection of the book is it moves into poetry called Theory of Ice, and that's an album that I recorded with my band, and was released in mid-March on You've Changed Records. And the cover image from that is by Anishinaabe artist Nadia Meyer, who beaded the Indian Act and then took photographs of the back. And so that's another project. There's a series of films, short films, sort of music videos that are attached to that are going to be released over the next year by Indigenous women filmmakers. And then my sister Ansley, who's a singer-songwriter from Toronto, and I released about a year ago the Nopaming Sessions, which are 4 readings over sort of electronica music that she composed. So I feel like I like it when my work travels in the world and comes into conversation with other artists, particularly other artists from other disciplines, so they can sort of interpret and use it as a jumping off point, and then it sort of creates its own ecosystem of networks. And that's sort of the thinking behind the cover image. It's also the same artist that did the cover for This Accident of Being Lost. And so the publisher was sort of on board to have a little bit of consistency with that. And then it managed to stay the same cover when it was released in the US. So yeah.
Yeah, that's exciting. And it calls back to that web of interconnected Indigenous artists that we spoke about earlier. Heid, how about you?
I'm going to show you. So there were no section breaks in my book, no titles for the sections. And eventually I didn't feel like that was going to work. So I asked them if I could use a wedge of asterisks. Oh, it's a hard word to say. I had to say it 36 times for one of the poems. And I started asking them to manipulate it. So 1 is just 1, 2, 3. And then by the end, it looks like this, which to me looks like a dancer or a two-hide dress, but it also looks like this depiction of Thunderbird. And so that's important to me. It's, it's just a little Easter egg. It's made of what is really a black star. And I listened to a lot of David Bowie when I was working on this book. I always listen to a lot of David Bowie. So it has that little Easter egg for me of, having a star for the loss of Bowie, who has been such an inspiration to me. The book is really big. The trim size is huge. Like you could put a small kid behind it. That was a choice the publisher made so that I didn't have to interrupt my long, really wide, taking up land breaks for the poems, and I was really grateful for that. And again, the cover artist is Andrea Carlson, who is the cover artist for one of my books, or actually her art is on the cover. She, did not make it with any intention of being on my book, although we're often in conversation about both her imagery and mine and what they have to do with each other. So yeah, so I felt really lucky that I was able to do that, and that I've been able to do that with all my books, have some input. And I was afraid because Penguin's a big publisher and it's a new publisher, and I didn't know if I was going to be able to ask, and they were very wonderful.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. The next question we've got is, I've been really struck by the talking of writing as a form of healing, especially from Alyssa. Could you speak to us writers in the audience who seek to do the same? Yeah, Alyssa, you want to start us off again?
Yeah, I would say that it's something I recommend doing with a lot of care and a lot of intention, and and a lot of I guess privacy maybe is the word, or like alone time, really. I think that healing is a really it's really serious work, and it's really painful along the way a lot of the time. It certainly is for me. And I know that it can be really, really hard to do that. I mean, for example, in a workshop setting in creative writing, for someone who hasn't done that before, trying to heal through writing, it's really hard to bring that to a workshop setting and ask someone to critique your healing. And so, I just recommend really, giving like such generous room to that process and to that work. But know that, you know, I find that it is very, very healing for me to create narrative, to just, you know, make sense of things on the page through putting them in connection with other things, through coming to insight, you know, sentence by sentence. It really has done a lot for me. It has, you know, completely changed my mental health in very real and noticeable ways. But when I do it, I really have to take a lot of care to give myself space to, you know, to be kind of wrecked, because I am when I'm writing and revising something really hard.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you, Alyssa.
Mm-hmm.
Leanne, do you have any advice for writers in the audience seeking to use the writing as a form of healing?
I think that was really good advice from Alyssa. I think making sure that you have a safe space to do that, to tell your truths or to write your truths, and to give yourself permission to feel all of the feelings, and write whatever you need to write is really important. And I think that needs to be done in a really boundaried way. So I think that that for me is quite separate from writing work that's going to be read publicly. I think it's really important for me to have done the healing ahead of time, before I go out into public to discuss my work, because I think that can be a very harsh experience to share work publicly. So I think particularly for Indigenous women, if writing and creating is something that is healing and is good for your mental health, and writing isn't always good for my mental health, but if that is something that is good for your mental health, then I think creating these spaces where you're not going to be marked or judged or rejected, or where you just have a very supportive, loving environment, is important.
Yeah, I think that's good advice too. Heid, anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll just be brief. The cover of my book, Little Big Bully, is a subtitle is a sigil against loss and fear of loss. And I think sometimes when we write within a place that needs to be healed, we are also encouraging ourselves, giving ourselves heart, and trying not to fear. And in that bravery, we will find, new healings and new answers. And just let yourself be surprised. Don't think just because you get the words on the page, some magic happens. Be open to being surprised by other things that you're able to do creatively when you're letting some of the steam out from pain.
Yep. Beautiful. Well, Pidamia Yepi to all three of you for sharing so much tonight and sharing your beautiful works with us. Just as a reminder to everyone in the audience, you can purchase all three of these books down below at the link for Loft's bookshop site. And sadly, it looks like our time together is coming to a close. So with that, Pidamia Yepi, not only to you three, but also to our wonderful Loft members who make these events possible, and to our sponsors, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune, as well as our partner, Voice of Witness. So please also don't forget to fill out the survey that will be headed your way via email after this session. Dokstake. See you again.
Miigwech.